Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Globus Books virtual salon, our internet living room, where tonight we are really excited to feature with the talk Kandinsky, dramatist, poet, talk and reading, Lissa Tyler Renaud. Lissa Tyler Renaud is an amazing specialist and expert on Kandinsky, and I will be introducing her formally and reading her bio. But before I do that, I just wanted to say that I met Lissa through Kandinsky. I, in fact, was late for the reading of Prose Poems by Kandinsky that Lissa did in a gallery in Berkeley. And I was so upset that I reached out, and Lissa was gracious enough to answer and send me some poems, and our exchange started. And for now, it's been many years, and I had an honor of listening to some of Lissa's talks and seeing a lot of her work as a publisher, editor, writer, essayist, because Lissa has 2 degrees, MFA in directing and PhD in theater history and criticism from UC Berkeley. She's also a lifelong actress, and since 1985, founder director of the Actors Training Project studio based in Oakland for training inspired by Kandinsky's work. Since 2004, as visiting professor, master teacher, invited speaker, actor, scholar, and recitalist, she has taught, lectured, and published widely on theater training, dramatic theory, and the early European avant-garde at major theater institutions of Asia, around the US, in England, Mexico, Russia, St. Petersburg, as far as I'm aware, and Sweden. She's also a founding editor of English-French Critical Stages magazine, where she's also a board member. She's a co-editor of the Politics of American Actor Training, published by Routledge, an invited chapter Routledge companion to Stanislavsky. She's also an editor of Wuzhen, and correct me, Lisa, if I'm pronouncing it wrong, I think it's Wuzhen Theater Festival in China, editor at Stan Lai, 12 plays, published by University of Michigan Press, and that is pending. And senior writer for Scene 4 and founder editor for Kandinsky and New Series. There's a number of other projects and things that I know Lissa is working on, and she will tell you more about it. I'm Zarina Zabriskie. I'm a writer from San Francisco, and I host and produce shows for Globus Books, which is an independent bookstore that serves San Francisco since 1971 and offers a wide range of books in Russian and now in English on all subjects possible, including theater, opera, music, and art. We have a lot of albums, including albums on Kandinsky, some rare books, some antique books. So check us out. It's www.globusbooks.com. We also have a lot of fantastic events coming, including events on arts and arts lectures and excursions to various places in the world. So with that being said, I am very excited to hand over the mic to Lissa.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest. I like to tell listeners what I'm going to do so they can pace themselves. I am reading a paper and then reading poems. Paper has an introduction, 3 sections, and a conclusion. Each of these is 6 or 8 minutes, which means 30 or 40 minutes. The poems will also be 30 or 40 minutes. I'd also like to dedicate my presentation to Lee Edgar Tyler, poet, scholar, and translator who fortified my work on Kandinsky for some years and died suddenly 10 days ago. The formal name of my paper is Kandinsky, Writings Towards the Theater of Synthesis. Introduction. Most people know that Kandinsky was a painter. Many people associate Kandinsky with the earliest abstract painting. Some people vaguely know his work was connected with spirituality. A few people know he did more than just paint or that he wrote a book about art. But not nearly enough people have had the pleasure of knowing Kandinsky's wonderful writings for the theater. Kandinsky wrote about the theater and for the theater roughly between 1908 and 1940. These writings can be loosely grouped into 1, dramatic theory, 2, plays, and 3, theater training, programs, and reform. Since his death in 1944, these have all been neglected. He led a nomadic life in art spanning World War I, the Russian Revolution, and World War II. Sadly, this means that documentation was lost and close colleagues were scattered across the globe or did not survive. But during his lifetime, Kandinsky's colleagues and publishers and many theatrical innovators of the time knew Kandinsky as a profound and original force in the theater. A few examples. When World War I began, Kandinsky was planning to write a theater book and to start a theater with an international group of artists. In Switzerland, Hugo Ball gave a 1917 lecture on Kandinsky at his Dada cabaret and praised him as, quote, a writer of incomparable verses, the creator of a new theatrical style, close quote. In 1918, in Russia, when the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment was forming a department of visual arts, it published Kandinsky's essay on the theater and made him head of a special theater and film section. In 1929, in Germany, painter-choreographer Oskar Schlemmer asked Kandinsky to take over his position as head of the famous experimental Bauhaus Theatre. So Kandinsky was involved in interesting theater-related projects, but today I am focusing on the writings. Kandinsky's life was a synthesis of disparate elements. He spent important years in Russia, but did his best-known work in Germany and his final work in France. He worked in a broad range of fields. He made historic contributions as a painter, wrote art criticism, and taught painting. He also wrote poetry, dramatic theory, and plays, and worked for reform in art and theater education. He had a background in law, economics, and ethnography. He played the piano and cello. At various times, he designed clothing and jewelry, wall murals, and briefly, even dishes. Kandinsky was very aware that this intermedia activity would confuse critics and historians. Toward the end of his life, he wrote, "Oh, I remember very well when I started writing poetry, I knew I would become suspect as a painter. They used to look askance at the painter whenever he wrote, even letters." It was in the theater that Kandinsky found a place to join, to synthesize his areas of training and interest. Kandinsky's success as a painter has also made him suspect as a theater artist. Art historians tend to think of Kandinsky's theater work as a painter's experiment, or think he was transferring his painted image from canvas to stage. But Kandinsky didn't believe this transfer was possible or desirable. Each art, he said, has its own means of expression and an exact translation of one art to another is impossible. Fortunately, close quote. Theater historians pay little attention to Kandinsky's theater work, lumping it together with the later performance art, or what has come to be called visual theater. But performance art rejects so many aspects of the traditional theater that Kandinsky held dear. Critic Michael Kirby, Kirby, observed, quote, "In the avant-garde theater, suspension of disbelief is not operative, and the absence of character and situation precludes identification," close quote. So we don't identify with the characters in performance art. Kandinsky took a conservative stance towards these fundamental dynamics of the theater. He was dedicated to the picture stage and to inviting the audience into a world that was not their own. Kandinsky thought of himself as bringing new life to the conventional stage, not abandoning it. Kandinsky's name is associated with the avant-garde movements now, but his ideas about the theater were already considered old-fashioned in Russia in the 1920s. In the introduction to their 1982 Kandinsky Complete Writings on Art, co-editors Lindsay and Vergo, Vergo, spoke to this. Quote, "Kandinsky's art differs so radically from traditional art that people are inclined to think him altogether estranged from the past. But Kandinsky's writings correct this impression by revealing how deeply his thinking was rooted in European thought and values," close quote. True, his conclusions about the theater are far from conventional, but the stage revolution he envisioned had firm roots in the sensibilities of the past. So, part one, the theoretical writings. Oops. These are the writings on theory. In one sense, classical dramatic theory revolves around the issue of the theater's function. Aristotle thought the theater had a civilizing function. The medieval theater served a religious function. Shakespeare created a theater celebrating language and the imagination. For Racine, the theater was a laboratory for examining the human core. Other dramatists, pivotal to the development of the drama, have envisioned theaters that were entertaining, moral, poetic, psychological, anthropological, and political. Kandinsky's theater reflected elements of all these to different degrees, but for him, the primary function of all art was spiritual, that is, beyond the material world. He wrote, quote, "Art is that creative force which expands the prison house of our being and allows a vision of eternity," close quote. Kandinsky thought people move in a world so rich in experience, perception, and sensation that they couldn't possibly organize all of it. He saw a gap between the amount of universal data we can receive and how much we can fully absorb. Art, then, is a kind of language for systematizing all the intuitive information that ordinarily escapes us. Art translates everything around us into a lexicon, maximizing our experience of the world. In modern dramatic theory, one of the issues at the crux is the changing relationship between language and the visual image. The Industrial Revolution brought with it a new world of noise. By the 20th century, the ancient song poems, the verses of Shakespeare, the cadences of Romanticism no longer express the experience of life. Its soundtrack, the industrial machine with its superficial rhythms. The sounds of war drowned out the language of words, and in its place, the language of visual images came into a new prominence. In this new, jagged world, Kandinsky's objections to the conventional theater joined a chorus of complaints that the theater had become nothing more than an offshoot of the literary tradition, that the poetic tradition was responsible for the withering of all theatrical means except language, that the drama was being simply peeled off the written page without being fully translated into a three-dimensional theatrical art. In this context, Kandinsky created the theater he called the synthetic or monumental art, in the sense of fusing or integrating all the arts. Although he had agreed with everyone about the theater's problems, the solutions he found were very different from theirs. Others struggled over which art form should unify the theatrical elements of the new theater. Wagner thought music should be the primary art form. Appiah's primary element was light. Edward Gordon Craig's was scenic design. Kandinsky's theater sidestepped this discussion. He believed all the arts should be separate and equal, not unified, but distinct languages. Where others looked for parallels between the arts, Kandinsky thought of them in dynamic opposition to one another. Where others tried to mirror one art in all the others, Kandinsky wanted to find a contrapuntal relationship between them. The different grammars of the art languages and their common goals formed the matrix of his synthetic art. For Kandinsky, the unique power of the theater is that it synthesizes or encompasses more languages of expression than other art forms do. His synthesis included everything from the structure of the building to the elements of the performance itself. They work together. The building creates tension and the performance releases it. Kandinsky means this: the drama of the theatrical play actually begins outside in the street. The theater building is a magnet that draws the building all the way, the theater building is a magnet that draws the public all the way from outside the building to its powerful center in the inner reaches of the stage. First, the open doors of the building, quote unquote, suck in streams of people. As unrelated people pass into the lobby, they become related to one another by their common purpose and space. That room unifies the individuals into an audience. Inside the theater, the seats unify the audience further, organizing them into rows, pointing them all in the same direction, focusing all their combined receptive attention on a single point, center stage. When the theater structure has concentrated all this tension to the maximum, The performance begins. In a charming prose poem from 1912, Kandinsky described the tension as the audience waits for this. Curtain. The rope came down and the curtain went up. We had all been waiting so long for this moment. The curtain hung. The curtain hung. The curtain hung. It hung down. Now it's up. As it went up, we were all so overjoyed. Then, so that's the end of the poem. Then, as each moment that unfolds on the stage is a small release of tension, and these releases then trigger bigger releases or responses in the audience. In that audience response is the ultimate release of all the power of all the arts. Part 2, the plays. This is the plays themselves. Here's a quick overview. Kandinsky mainly completed 3 short plays between 1908 and 1909. Green Sound, Black and White, and Black Figure. At the same time, he began the full-length play, Yellow Sound, which he finished and published in Munich in 1912. In 1914, he wrote his longest play, and my favorite, Violet, and what might be an afterpiece for it, Apotheosis. A portion of Violet was published in 1927 at the Bauhaus School of Architecture and Design, where he was famously working. The next year, in Dessau, he created a scenic play of sets, props, and lights for Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition. Of these plays, people tend to find Yellow Sound the most approachable, maybe because it was published along with Kandinsky's essay on stage composition. There, he explained how he had tried to apply his theories of synthesis and counterpoint in Yellow Sound. He was not quite sure it had worked. His final words before the pages of the play text began were, quote, "The reader is asked not to ascribe to the principle the weaknesses of the following short composition, Yellow Sound, but to attribute them to the author," close quote. In other words, if the play was weak, it was because his skills as a playwright hadn't served his theories of the stage. The mood and look of Yellow Sound are easier to communicate than their stories. They have no literary value at all. They seem to take place outside of time, in a world where the environment is at least as active as the figures who live in it. The music and sounds that emanate from the space seem to be in dialogue with hills or trees. Light moves, changes color, or darkens in reaction to simple gestures. Flowers shudder as if they were human, and people grow as if they were plants. The real protagonists of these plays are the stage elements that usually support the action, and the characters are only a part of what one scholar called a cosmic melodrama. The role the gods play in Greek drama is played here by nature, but like the gods, the natural world is more forceful than logical. Kandinsky's choruses are similar to some Greek choruses, crowds of barely differentiated figures, dimly grasping at comprehension, perhaps half a step behind the truth. Unlike the classical hero, Kandinsky's heroes achieve stature mainly due to their calm in the face of fear, confusion, and loss. Aristotle's narrative drama attempted to explain the peaks and valleys we experience in our lives. Kandinsky's synthetic drama attempted to reveal an inner landscape where everything is an event, nothing can be explained, and the real story takes place in some intuitive dimension, invisibly. Like music, these plays don't tell a story, but they have meaning. Like painting, their form is not linear, but they have structure. Like dance, each piece has statement, development, and closure. Like architecture, the plays depend on tensions and counter-tensions. Like sculpture, the plays give shape to volumes in space, and with poetry, they share the element of sound in time. Kandinsky's Yellow Sound was a victim of political instabilities and was never staged. It was planned for production in Munich in 1914, in Berlin in 1922, and then at the Bauhaus in 1927. 10 years after this last attempt, Kandinsky wrote wistfully in a letter, quote, "But once again, it didn't work out. Such things have their own destinies," close quote. But in a New York lecture in 1950, after Kandinsky's death, and nearly 40 years after he wrote Yellow Sound, the composer Thomas von Hartmann still called Yellow Sound, quote, "the greatest venture of stage art to this day." Part 3, the theater training, reform, and programs. Kandinsky observed that poor arts teaching reinforces the walls between different areas of our experience. In life, for example, our material lives are separated from our non-material or spiritual lives, and this separation is reflected in training. That is, the practical aspects of art are taught without wider human values. The sciences are separated from the arts are separated from one another. Even within the individual arts, painters are divided into isms, poets into schools, and actors into methods. Kandinsky wrote, "Nearly the whole of the 19th century consisted of a more or less calm process of ordering, categorization, and division. The astronomer had just as little time for Sanskrit as the musician had for sculpture. On this basis, all possible kinds of colleges were built, which produced highly trained specialists and completely uneducated people, and still do today." Close quote. Kandinsky believed that art education's function is to counteract this divisive approach to both life and art, and to provide a broad philosophical basis. The synthetic art requires the synthetic artist, and to answer the need for a new kind of education, Kandinsky developed the curricula for 2 arts training programs. He developed his first training program in Russia in the turbulent period following the revolution. He intended it as a graduate or continuing education program to give working artists the interdisciplinary education they had missed in their original training. He proposed a series of joint seminars for painters, sculptors, architects, musicians, dancers, poets, and theater people. They would all study together, beginning with a theoretical study of the most basic components of the individual arts. From this solid foundation, they would develop as artists together in small analytical increments, comparing and integrating their disciplines at each step. At the end of this cumulative method of study, they would be able to create the organic, monumental work that integrated all of the arts, a collaborative piece for the stage. Kandinsky's program was going to be implemented at the Russian Academy of Artistic Sciences, but instead, Kandinsky left for Germany. There, Kandinsky spent the years from 1922 to 1933 at the Bauhaus, perhaps the most famous interdisciplinary art conservatory in history, with its own experimental theater. His writings of this period reflect his work as school administrator and master teacher, and his ongoing involvement with the problems of art teaching. He wrote extensively on the purpose and structuring of an education in the arts, explaining his own system of instruction, both explicitly and by inference, and always insisting that his approach would benefit teaching in all the arts with special reference to the theater. I recommend the endless administrative planning memos for the Bauhaus as thrilling reading for anyone interested in interdisciplinary education. Kandinsky's second art program then was designed for arts students just beginning their training in a 4-year conservatory setting. His goal was to give the students a balance of practical and theoretical knowledge, of intuition and calculation, of skills for analyzing and integrating. They were to move freely between all the departments and choose their own yearly projects. As in his Russian program, his courses followed a highly systematic progression. The first term focused on isolating and juxtaposing elements of structure. The second term covered content and complexity. The third term, content and simplicity. Each year, the students would meet with more different problems and the skills to solve them. Kandinsky was optimistic about the future of the theater if theater training could be reformed. Conclusion. First, allow me a personal note. I grew up around the theater and images of Kandinsky's paintings. Later, as I became an actress, then director and scholar, at each turn, I kept finding what I needed in Kandinsky's writings, and this has never stopped. Around 1982, when I was developing as a teacher, I began to focus on Kandinsky's statement that every art discipline should be taught in exactly the same way, and that his system of instruction, quote, should be the method for all other areas of teaching, close quote. One passage particularly caught my eye, quote, merely apply the corresponding principles laid down for painting, and of its own accord, the happy dream of the theater of the future will rise up. Right? I'm going to read that again. Quote, merely apply the corresponding principles laid down for painting, and of its own accord, the happy dream of the theater of the future will rise up. These few sentences, as they say, changed my life. In 1985, I founded the Actors Training Project to offer Kandinsky's unusual training principles to theater students. This program ran for 20 years in California, and since 2004, I have introduced this work in major theater institutions, especially around Asia, and in North America, as well as in Russia, Sweden, and Mexico. In October 2014, I introduced Kandinsky's theater work at the Shanghai Theater Academy in the second of two lectures on Stanislavsky with the title, Towards a New Actor, Stanislavsky, Kandinsky, Schlemmer. To conclude, in 1976, his wife wrote that Kandinsky's greatest ambition was to create a large-scale multimedia ballet. On the threshold of World War II, already in his 70s, Kandinsky was still discussing plans for his multimedia ballet with the great Russian choreographer Massine. Ultimately, over decades of upheaval, the solitary painter's work proved more viable than the collaborative theater did. If we give his work serious attention now, early in the 21st century, we may finally see the theater Kandinsky saw early in the 20th century. Thank you. One thing I always say is that it's kind of a shame that translations for his work tend to be wooden and stuffy and a bit full of hot air or something. But having read them for many years, I find him very funny and ironic. And he has just a wonderful sense of humor that he's sticking in there every once in a while. Right when you think things are getting serious, he takes a jab at somebody or some silly idea, or he's very outspoken about what he thinks is silly. So I'm going to read some poems, his poems. So these are dedicated to Zarina, who missed them the first time I read them some years ago in the gallery she mentioned. Introduction to poems, yes. Kandinsky published his first poems in the early 1910s and his last poems close to 1940, actually 1939. But it's easy to remember, right? 1910, 1940. He was well known in experimental poetry circles as, quote unquote, a writer of incomparable verses. In the 1880s, as a student, he had done ethnographic research on shamanism. And this is perhaps reflected in his poetry. In any case, he was interested in separating words from their meaning. And he does this in different ways. For example, by repeating a word until it becomes pure sound, by using a word in odd ways or with strange punctuation, or by referring to peculiar rituals or gestures. And sometimes he's just being funny. Between 1909 and 1911, Kandinsky wrote Sounds, a group of 38 poems. I am reading 23 of them in the Peter Virgo translation, and then I'll read a few other poems. Hills. A mass of hills in every conceivable, imaginable color, of all different sizes, but always the same shape. i.e., broad at the bottom with swollen sides and rounded tops. Simple, ordinary hills, of the kind one always imagines and never sees. Between the hills winds a narrow path of simple white, i.e., neither blue-white nor yellow-white, having neither blue nor yellow in it. Clad in a long black seamless robe, which covers even his ankles, a man walks along this path. His face is pale, except for 2 patches of red on his cheeks. His lips, too, are red. Hung about him is a big drum, and he drums. The man walks very oddly. Sometimes he runs, dealing his drum feverish, irregular blows. Sometimes he walks slowly, perhaps immersed in thought, and drums almost mechanically in a long, drawn-out rhythm. 1, 1, 1, 1. Sometimes he stands quite still and thumps like the soft white pet rabbit we all love. But he doesn't stand still for long. Then the man starts to run again, dealing his drum feverish, irregular blows. As if completely exhausted, he lies there, the black man, stretched out on the white path amidst the hills of all colors. His drum lies beside him, and the 2 drumsticks as well. He stands up. He's about to run again. I observe all this from above and request you, likewise, to look down on it from above. See. S-E-E. Blue, blue, rose up and fell. Sharp, thin whistled and pressed in, but could not prick through. There was a droning in every corner. Fat, brown, hung seemingly for all eternity. Seemingly. You must stretch your arms out wider, wider. And you must cover your face with a red cloth. And perhaps it has not yet moved. Only you have been moved. White crack after white crack, and after this white crack, another white crack, and in this white crack, a white crack, in every white crack, a white crack. It just won't do that you can't see the opaque. The opaque is just where it is. And that's how it all starts. There was a crash. Open. Now vanishing slowly in the green grass. Now sticking in the gray mud. Now vanishing slowly in the white snow. Now sticking in the gray mud. Lay long. Thick, long black reeds. Lay long. Long reeds. 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 Cage. It was torn. I took it in both hands and held the 2 ends together. Round about something grew, close about me, and yet there was nothing to be seen. Indeed, I thought there was nothing there, and yet I could not move forward. I was like a fly under a cheese cover, i.e., nothing visible, and yet insuperable. It was even empty. All alone in front of me stood a tree, in fact, a sapling, its leaves as green as verdigris, thick as iron and just as hard. Small red apples hung with a blood-colored glow from the branches. That was all. Bell. Once upon a time, a man in Weiskirchen said, "I shall never, never do that." At exactly the same time, a woman in Mühlhausen said, "Beef with horseradish." Each said his own sentence, for they had no alternative. I hold a pen in my hand and write with it. I would not be able to write with it if it had no ink. The big, strong beast, which greatly enjoyed chewing and ruminating, was stunned by quick, successive, dull, resounding hammer blows upon its skull. It collapsed. From an opening in its body, blood flowed freely, much thick, sticky, odorous blood flowed interminably. With what marvelous skill the thick, warm velvet skin, with its beautiful pattern of brown-white hairs, was carved up. Flayed skin and red, steaming, reeking flesh. Very flat country, vanishing flatly to every horizon. At the extreme left, a small birch coppice, still very young, tender, white trunks and bare branches. Nothing but brown fields, neatly plowed in straight furrows. In the midst of this gigantic circle, a small village, only a few gray-white houses. Right in the middle, a church tower. The little bell is tolled by a rope and goes ding, 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 ding. Earth. The heavy earth was loaded with heavy spades onto carts. The carts were loaded and grew heavy. Men shouted at the horses. Men cracked their whips, heavily drew the horses, the heavy carts with the heavy earth. Spring. Be quiet, you garish fellow. Slowly the old houses slide down the hill. The old blue sky sticks hopelessly amidst branches and leaves. Stop calling me. Hopelessly, the ringing hangs in the air like a spoon in a thick gruel. One's feet stick in the grass, and the grass wants to prick through the invisible with its points. Lift your axe above your head and chop, chop. Your words can't reach me. They're hanging on the bushes like wet tatters. Why doesn't anything grow? Only this rotting wooden cross at the fork in the road, and its arms have penetrated the air to right and to left, and its head has pierced a hole in the sky, and from its edges creep stifling red-blue clouds. And thunderbolts tear and cut them in places you least expect, and their cuts and tears mend invisibly. And somebody falls like a soft eider down, and somebody speaks, speaks, speaks. Is that you again, you garish fellow? You again? Some things. A fish went deeper and deeper into the water. It was silver. The water blue. I followed it with my eyes. The fish went deeper and deeper, but I could still see it. Oh, I could see it no more. I could still see it, even when I could not see it. Yet I saw the fish. Yet I saw it. I saw it, 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 I saw it. A white horse stood quietly on long legs. The sky was blue. Its legs were long. The horse was motionless. Its mane hung down and did not move. The horse stood motionless on long legs, but it was alive. No flexing of the muscles, no quivering of the hide. It was alive. Yet it was alive. On the broad meadow grew a flower. The flower was blue. There was only one flower on the broad meadow. Yet it was there. Some of these I so much look forward to. This is one. It's called Not. The jumping man interested me a great deal. He excited me. He had dug a small, very round hollow in the flat, hard, dry earth, and every day he jumped ceaselessly across it from 4 o'clock until 5. He jumped from one side of the hollow to the other with an effort that would have sufficed for a hole 3 yards wide, and at once back again. And at once back again. And at once back again. Back, oh, back again, again, oh, again, 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 again. You shouldn't be a witness to something like that. But if you happened to be there already, even if only once, one single tiny time, then, yes, then how are you supposed to avert your eyes? How could you not go? Not go. The not is sometimes impossible to attain. Who among men, who at this time live out the second and last half of their life on earth, does not know? Everyone knows, which is why I have to keep going to the jumping man. And he excites me. He makes me sad. He never go, never look at him, never. It's already after 3:30. I must go, otherwise I shall be late. Sounds. Face. Distance. Cloud. There stands a man with a long sword. The sword is long and broad, too, very broad. He often sought to deceive me, and I confess he succeeded in deceiving me, and perhaps too often. Eyes, 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 eyes. A woman who is thin and not young, who has a cloth on her head which sticks out like a shield over her face, leaving her face in shadow. The woman pulls a calf on a rope, still small and shaky on its crooked legs. Sometimes the calf runs along behind quite willingly. Sometimes he doesn't want to. Then the woman pulls on the rope. It lowers its head and shakes it and splays its legs, but its legs are weak, and the rope does not break. The rope does not break. Eyes look from a distance. The cloud ascends. The face, the distance. The cloud, the sword, the rope. The break. The small man wanted to break the chain and, of course, could not. The big man broke it quite easily. The small man wanted to escape straight away. The big man held him by the sleeve, leaned toward him, and said softly in his ear, "We must keep quiet about this." And they both laughed heartily. Different. It was a big 3, white on dark brown. The curve at the top was the same size as the curve at the bottom. So thought many people. And yet the top was slightly bigger than the bottom. This 3 always looked to the left, never to the right. At the same time, it looked slightly downward, for the figure only seemed to stand perfectly upright. In reality, although it was not easy to notice, the larger top part was slightly inclined to the left. So this big white 3 looked always to the left and a fraction downward. It could perhaps have been different. White foam. I should very much like to know why it is so and not otherwise. It could be different, quite different. On a raven-colored horse, a woman rides across flat green meadows. I cannot see the far side of these meadows. The woman is dressed in red, her face concealed by a canary yellow veil. The woman whips the horse unmercifully, but it cannot gallop any faster. It's gasping as it is, increasingly covered with hot, white foam. The woman sits upright, unswerving, and whips the black horse. Don't you think it would be better for the black horse to die? It's all white, with hot, white foam. But it cannot die. No, oh, it cannot. How different it might be. Quite different. Hymn, Hymm. There the blue wave rocks. The torn red cloth, red rags, blue waves, the old book closed up. Gaze in silence at the distance. Wander blindly in the wood. The blue waves grow deeper. The red cloth soon sinks below. Later, I shall find you in the deep heights, where the smooth pricks, where the sharp cannot cut. You hold the ring in your left hand. I hold the ring in my right hand. Neither sees the chain, but these rings are the last links in the chain. The beginning, the end. Adventure. I once visited a group of villas where nobody lived. All the houses were decorated in white and had firmly closed green shutters. In the middle of this group of villas was a green square covered with grass. In the middle of this square stood a very old church with a high bell tower with a pointed roof. The big clock went but did not strike. At the foot of this bell tower stood a red cow with a very fat belly. It stood motionless, chewing sleepily. Whenever the minute hand on the clock pointed to the quarter, the half hour, or the hour, the cow would bellow, "Hey, don't be so frightened!" Then it would start chewing again. Springtime. In the west, the new moon. In front of the new moon's horns, a star. A narrow, tall, black house. 3 lighted windows. 3 windows. 2. In the brilliant yellow are pale blue flecks. Only my eyes saw the pale blue flecks. They did my eyes good. Why did nobody else see the pale blue flecks in the yellow brilliance? 3. Dip your fingers in the boiling water. Boil your fingers. Let your fingers sing of pain. Leaves. I can remember something. A very large triangular black mountain reached up to the sky. Scarcely visible was its silvery summit. To the right of this mountain stood a tree, which was very thick and had a thick green crown. The crown was so thick that the individual leaves could not be separated from one another. To the left, there grew only on one patch, but very densely, small white blossoms that looked like little flat plates. Otherwise, there was nothing. I stood in front of this landscape and looked. Suddenly, a man comes riding up from the right. He rode a white ram, which looked perfectly ordinary, except that its horns pointed not backward, but forward. And its tail was not turned up in the usual impudent way, but hung down and was bald. The man, however, had a blue face and a short snub nose. He laughed, showing his small, wide apart, rather worn and yet very white teeth. I also noticed something sharp red. I was very surprised when the man grinned at me. He rode slowly past and disappeared behind the mountain. Curious thing was that when I looked again at the landscape, all the leaves lay on the ground, and on the left, the flowers had all gone. There were only red berries. The mountain, of course, remained motionless. This time. Table. It was a long table. Oh, a long, long table. To the right and left of this table sat many, many, many people. Oh, long, long they sat, these people at this long, long table. Bright meadow. In a meadow in which there was no grass, but only flowers, which were extremely colorful, 5 men sat in a straight line. A 6th stood to one side. The first said, "The roof is firm the roof, firm." After a while, the second said, "Don't touch me, I sweat, I'm sweating, yes." And then the third, "Not over the wall, not over the wall, no." Whereupon the fourth, "Ripening fruit." After a long silence, the fifth cried with a piercing voice, "Wake him up, make him open his eyes wide. There's a stone rolling down from the mountain. Ah, stone, a stone, a stone, a stone from the mountain. It's rolling down. Make his ears eager. Oh, make his eyes wide, make his legs long, long, long his legs." The 6th, who stood to one side, cried out, short and sharp, "Silence!" The tower. Man in green tights with his mustache turned upward lay almost full length upon the green meadow. I never liked him. Red toadstools were all around. Woman came out from the green forest. She was blue. I found her unpleasant. She sat down beside him and all the toadstools vanished, were gone. Man stood up and went, and woman beside him. Thus they walked out of the green forest toward the big red house. The gray door was firmly locked. The door was not there. She went in, then he too went in. They often stand right up at the top of the tower, something that is unpleasant. The gray door is firmly locked. Gaze and thunderbolt. That while he, the man, wanted to feed himself, the thick white comb cast off the rosebird. Now she rubs the windows wet in wooden towels, not to the distant, but to the bent. Discharged itself like the chapel. Hey, hey! Semicircular, pure. Circles press almost upon chessboards and iron books. Kneeling beside the jagged ox, wants Nuremberg, wants to lie. Horrifying weight of the eyebrows. Heaven, heaven, imprinted ribbons you can bear. Even from my head, the leg of the short-tailed horse with the pointed mouth might grow. But the short-tailed horse with the pointed mouth might grow. But the red prong, the yellow heel at the North Pole, like a rocket at midday. This next poem is the last one of these poems from Sounds, and it's one of the ones I've retranslated with my frequent cohort, my recently frequent cohort, the great Kandinskyist, Yelena Hall-Fontaine. The other poems are in English for the first time ever, in translations by myself and Yelena Hall-Fontaine, formerly Hall Koch, K-O-C-H. People may recognize her name. She's been working on Kandinsky for many, many, many decades and authored the magnificent monograph, Kandinsky. The soft. Everyone lay on his own horse, which was unsightly and indecent. It is in any case better if a thick bird sits on a not his skinny twig with the little trembling living leaf. Anyone can kneel, whoever cannot learns how. Can everyone see the spires? Open the door, or the tissue fold will blow the roof off. So that's the end of sounds. Yelena Hall-Fontaine and I have also translated some other poems. Here are two medium-sized, short ones. They're of special interest because he wrote them in the months before the war began in 1914. And he doesn't talk about the war explicitly. In fact, he said later that he didn't actually know that there would be a war, but he felt that in some other dimension, something was going wrong. And so you can hear a feeling that he had. The first one is called 3 Rooms. In one room, in the middle, stood a square, heavy kitchen table. Lying on it was a gray-yellowed striped cat, with her legs stretched long as if stuck into her body. She slept as deeply as if she were dead. In another room next to it, hanging high from the ceiling, a small cage where a canary was sitting. He fluffed up his feathers and looked like a ball. In front of the window, a table, varnished black, was lying on its back. Next to it in the third room was a light mahogany table, leaning against the wall on 3 legs. The 4th leg was lying not far off. In the middle of the room stood a braided mouse trap. In it was sitting a mouse, totally still, wet with the sweat of fear. Okay. Secret meaning. Thousands of worms gave in to the way one did things. They obeyed the new order with tears. Here, some of them moved in pairs to the right and left and also up and down. Many gather in sausage-like masses for the walk. In long sausage-like masses, others are able to make many circles in the air and grab some necessities. and not so many tremble in clumps and measure time in beats, and the others, not so numerous, grind good nourishment into sack forms. They like to do that. They do not care what they make. Whither leads them the pressed new order? Is that the crown or the prison? Well, there are three really short ones that Yelena and I also have translated. These are for the first time, either translated for the first time or for the first time in English. This is called Basis. It's not wise if everything is wise. Something has to be wrong there. And when everything is right, then it is certainly not wise. Many people stand while walking. I just leave you with that thought. No. The next one is question. To open a door is easy. To close a door is difficult, especially when there is a draft. And when is there no draft? And this will indeed be the last one, the measure. From here to there, 3.5. From there to here, 4 1/8. Oh, the pain of it. Why measure the sun? From here in to there in, 79 3/11. You have now heard 23 of the poems from Sounds, and I guess 5 others.
I hesitate to make any sounds after that, and I wish we could just linger into the silence. But I'm sure, though, that people would love to jump on such an opportunity and ask some questions. And I'm gonna abuse my position as a host and producer and jump in with a couple of questions in myself. Sounds were first written in German, right? So this is translation from German, because then he translated it into Russian, but that publication didn't do well and kind of disappeared. Is this correct?
Opposite. He seems to have originally written them in Russian, and there was a Russian publication planned, but we don't know exactly what happened, but in the literature it's been referred to as ill-fated. It was an ill-fated publication, and so he translated them into German, and they were translated in Munich by Piper in 1912. But I mean, it's an interesting question, because actually I'm so thrilled that I knew the answer to that. But it's also interesting because the information continues to come out. And so sometimes we read something and then 20 years later, some kind of an archive or somebody has seen something that hasn't been seen before. And suddenly there'll be new information. So that's to say that the information about Kandinsky is still surfacing, which is why there are still poems that have never been translated or published. Nobody even knows they exist, which is just terrible. It's all terrible. So anyway, that's to answer you. Sometimes there isn't one answer, or sometimes I've known something for decades a certain way, and then suddenly there's a new publication that says something completely different. I just saw in Complete Writings on Art that I mentioned before, the Lindsay Virgo translation. I just saw, he says in the introduction that Franz Marc was Kandinsky's only friend. But that was written in 1982, and since then we have terrifically different information. I mean, so different. We have correspondences. We have, in fact, in my series, which we'll be talking about before the end, I think we just, or it's still now, it's still current, about Thomas von Hartmann, who was, we might think now, Kandinsky's best friend, his closest friend. Or there's a wonderful, right on the shelf behind me, there's a wonderful set of letters published between, wonderful, you must read, between Kandinsky and Joseph Albers, who kept inviting Kandinsky to come to Black Mountain College. And Kandinsky was already in his late 60s, and he felt like he just couldn't make himself start again in a new language. He didn't know English. He didn't know any English, right? He knew Russian, he knew German, he knew French. There's a lot of disagreement about how wonderful he was in these various languages. Some people say he had grown up in them. Some people say he was pretty terrible. Anyway, we don't know. But anyway, he didn't come. And the upside of that is that we have his correspondence with Joseph Albers, who was here in the United States. Just fabulous. But that's what I mean. I mean, for years, for decades, we were reading that Franz Marc was his only real friend, but that's just complete nonsense. We know now, we've known, so the information keeps changing. That's all I wanted to say. Who knows, tomorrow we'll find some other version of sounds that we don't know anything about.
I wanted to share the book that Lissa is mentioning is this one. It's by Lindsay and Virgo, and it's a complete writings on art. And it has this sounds in this translation with a woodcut in black and white. But supposedly there were color ones as well, but that at least it's not in this particular book. If anybody is interested in this or other writings by Kandinsky, I also represent Globus Books. So go no further, send me a note. We'll find you one just like the one I have here.
Just to say, the one that you have was originally published in 2 volumes. And yes, not long ago, they put them into 2, they put the 2 into 1 volume in paperback, so you can see that. And they say that they added something like 12 more of the images than were in the hardcover 2 volumes I have. There are also 2 other ones, other translations, one by a woman named Napier, and also a newish one by somebody unfamiliar. It's very new, and I hope it's not rude to say it had, people have said that it's extremely incomplete. But the point I want to make is that nobody claims to have been able to publish sounds accurately with all of the images and all the images in the correct placement. It just would somehow be so expensive. So not in my 2 volumes, not in your volume, not in the Napier or the new one. They're getting as close as they can. And of course they say that in their introductions, right? That we got as absolutely close as we can. Yes, there were black and white woodcuts and color woodcuts. They're not illustrations of the poems. They're somethings, maybe some internal relationship that he felt with the poems and the images. There are a couple of color ones. Google them. You just put Kandinsky sounds, woodcuts, or illustrations, or something, and they will just, go into Google Images, and they will just pop up in all their glory, and you can see many, many, many.
Thank you, Lisa. That was terrific.
Oh, thank you
Really
so
wonderful.
much.
I generally tend to distrust recitations, particularly theatrical recitations of,
Oh God, I know.
particularly of experimental prose, of the style, say, of Daniel Harms and writers like that. But you pulled it off just splendidly. A very, like a microscopic question there is if you could maybe talk about, say, challenges that reciting this particular work involves for you. What do you really work on when you prepare? What kind of difficulties do you encounter? What do you try to convey, or rather maybe to focus on? I mean, I know as an actor, as a reader reciter, you obviously focus on so many things, but what is maybe more important for you to try and put it out there? And also, you said that you were taking part in the translation. You collaborated on the translation as well. So maybe that's the other part of the question. What kind of challenges did you experience while trying to bring this forward into English?
Okay, one thing that's difficult is, as I tried to say from the beginning, he's punctuated them in extremely idiosyncratic ways. So you're going along like a normal person reading, and suddenly there's an exclamation point, or there are 25 ellipses, dots. Okay, so I have to find a balance between being true to what's on the page, being as idiosyncratic as he is, so not kind of smoothing things over without boring people to death. It can be hard to listen, and you have to listen with your ear, but also with your mind's eye, because so much of it is just a moment or a description, like a cloud, a tower, and there's not much to do except get your mind's eye interested. Even your ear it's not even going to do much for your ear. It has to go straight into your mind's eye. And so how to do what he's done, or sometimes there are sentence or lines or sentences that just make absolutely no sense. So you're going along and I don't know, there's a cow or something, or a bell or something, and then something wants Nuremberg to something. Like, what? It just doesn't, like, what is that? But it's what's wonderful. It's just so delightful. So I think that is maybe the most difficult. Now, note again that I selected them. I didn't read all 32. I selected them, moving from one to the next, trying on the one hand to get some flow, trying to help people hear where two poems in a row might be kind of connected or related to each other. Like there were two in a row about it might have been very different or something like that. There were two like that. So doing some like that where you can hear the connection, and then others where I was really looking for a change of tone and rhythm, something that would keep people awake. I mean, keep people interested. So you're going, there's some kind of a very repetitive, shamanic sounding thing. And then try to get something where you can hear his even sometimes goofy sense of humor. I mean, just like dorky. sometimes he's just so dorky, and that's not what we usually get from him. You know, all the photos of him, he's always looking very well-to-do and put together and serious, but he wasn't. He was a complete nut. He spent most of his life afraid he was going to have a nerve. I mean, he did have several nervous breakdowns, and he had an uncle who was schizophrenic and killed himself with an overdose of morphine. I mean, he had all this insanity and depression around him and in him. His life was hard. He was thrown out of country after country. He was known through his whole life as mixed race. He wasn't even considered Russian enough for the Russians. He had an Asiatic heritage. So he was seen as kind of a half breed. And when people didn't like him, they always referred to his Asiatic heritage. When I can latch on to something goofy, in him, that's how his closest friends described him. They always talked about his sense of humor and how much he laughed, how they went to a party and Kandinsky was the life of the party, or they always went hiking with him because he was so hilarious and kept everybody laughing. This is just not what we have in the literature. When I was a graduate student and just fell completely in love with Kandinsky, as I say, I had grown up with him, but I stumbled on his theater in maybe 1984 or so, and I immediately learned about the work of this Yelena Hall Koch. Yelena Hall, H-A-H-L, and she always puts formerly Koch, K-O-C-H, Hall Koch, yes, Koch, who had been the curator of the Kandinsky bequest when it first came into the museum. And I just completely fell in love with her work. I just thought she had access to more information than anybody else. And she was thoughtful and funny and outspoken about it in a way that I did not get from other scholars. And I followed her work and I pattered around after her. I flew hither and thither to her lectures when I could. So in 2017, so that was in the 1980s, right? Skip to 2017, and somebody in Brazil invited me to work on a special issue on Kandinsky's theater. But I got up all my nerve and I wrote to Yelena and I said, I've just been your fan for so many years.
And it took you 40 years to confess.
You know what happened? She said, oh, I know you. I can't remember where we met, but I just floated on air for weeks after that. It was so exciting. Anyway, she and I fell into a correspondence, and that involved talking about his theater and everything else Kandinsky does. And we fell into talking about the works that have not been translated. Even his wife's Kandinsky and I, or Kandinsky and Me, has never appeared in English. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable what has not been translated. I mean, look at the theater work. Nobody even knows it exists. Just astonishing. Anyway, so we started talking about what hasn't been translated, and she is fluent in both in Russian, French, and German. Russian and German. Russian natively German, where she's studied and worked her whole life. She's now in her 80s, and I only say that because I'm sure she'll listen to this, because she herself often introduces herself. I'm a scholar now in my 80s. And French. She lives in Belgium now. She's easily trilingual, and she also speaks English. And I have worked on translations from various languages, including Russian, my whole life. I think we just couldn't help ourselves. You know, she would send something and we just kind of fell into it. I don't know. It wasn't very formal. There are, well, it's become more formal over the months. Again, that's my series that I'll talk about. I don't know Russian and I don't know German. I can recognize words for research, you know, but I don't really know them, although I've been close to the Russian language for many years. My French is okay, and I can read pretty fluently in French. So between all of those and her quadrilinguality, I just made up a word, and my own sense of translation, we put them together. And I just had the experience of looking back again while I was preparing for the reading. Well, are there other translations that I like better than the Virgo, or better than something that we've translated? I didn't read everything we've translated. And I thought ours were damn good. Really. I didn't look at another one and think, oh yeah, no, maybe I shouldn't read that. Or, oh yeah, they use this really interesting word. I wish we'd thought of that. No, I didn't think of that at all. I thought we did a great job. Anyway, I hope that there's much more to come. And as I say, my mostly German translator has just died suddenly. So here I can put out a call for somebody who might be interested in working on Kandinsky from German. There's another gentleman who is fluent in Russian and English, and I've been putting him together with Yelena, hoping that they will do a thing with again, untranslated poems. It's just such an honor and a joy to work with her.
Thank you, Ivan. I should say that Ivan Sokolov is also a poet. Ivan will be also featured and a translator, literary translator of poetry.
Translating from?
Normally from English. My big project is Gertrude Stein, but
that's my other series of readings. I'm very devoted to Stein, and I think I often think there's a lot of relationship between the sound that Kandinsky gets and the sound that Stein gets. There are a couple of lines that sound like they're right out of Stein.
I kept thinking about that while you were reading, particularly that table poem, The Long Table and Long.
Isn't that amazing? So I think that must be a description of The Last Supper, don't you think? Like you're looking at a painting of a long table, and there are all the people over here and all the people over here, and it's a long, long table, and they sit there for a long time. Something. Yes, absolutely. Kandinsky and Stein, they are right. They belong together. I tried over the years to find out if they hadn't met, but I don't think they did. I don't think Stein was interested.
And also, I love when this happens. It happened a few times in Globus talks where there's some serendipity and there are calls placed out for collaboration and they've been answered, or people meet after not seeing each other for 20 years and suddenly meet on the talk. That happened twice, actually. And then I could see maybe you guys, maybe something will come out of it or not. But it's just interesting for me to see this magic happening, because some of us who work at Globus physically know that this place has some unusual energy, and certain things gravitate, literary things, that is. So, and I'm not into New Age or anything like that. We just see them happening.
That is certainly serendipity to meet somebody who puts those two poets together in their minds. But Zarina, I have to also tell you that there's somebody else on this call who is labeling herself Kathy, who I'm seeing in her face for the first time in something like 40 years. She was an acting student of mine in, God, the 1970s or so, no, 1980s. And we've stayed in touch, and she's a wonderful painter.
And maybe we'll see if Cassie has a question, but there is a question from Matthew Solomon, who's also our frequent guest, who has a question from YouTube audience. Matthew asks, do you feel an appreciation of Wassily Kandinsky's writings is necessarily dependent on an appreciation of his paintings? And he says, I didn't mean dependent, more like derivative of, like, so you got the question, right? Like, do you think that people are interested in his writing because they first are familiar and interested in his paintings?
Yelena does make the point that at the same time he's writing these poems where he's breaking up the language and doing all these different things in the language, it really is at the same time it's happening in his painting. The other part might surprise Matthew. I said that I grew up around Kandinsky's paintings, his images. I did. My father was just very passionate about Kandinsky and Miro, clay, and teaching me to look at them, to see, to look at them. Okay, now I'll tell you a secret. I didn't really like most of Kandinsky's paintings. I fell in love with his writings. It was his writings that just catapulted me into a new life. And I have worked so hard to love his paintings, and I do, most of them. Part of it is what we were saying before, is that so little has been translated. I think most people associate Kandinsky with painting. They just don't seek out his writings because they're not that much in the public eye. I mean, people who are studying painting or something may read or be recommended concerning the spiritual in art or on the spiritual in art. People who are very deep in their art training might be reading his other one, Point and Line to Plane. There's a really marvelous woman who's the moderator for a Facebook page on Kandinsky. It has, if you've never seen it, it's worth going and snooping around, because she has over 72,000 members, and she just snoops around the world to collections that nobody's seen or private collections and posts them day after day after day after day on Facebook. It is just a miracle. So I hear the kinds of things people say and the kinds of questions they ask, and they're interested in the paintings. You know, they're interested generally in the idea that, oh, he did other stuff. I always think it's like, oh, if we suddenly found out that Picasso also had a career playing golf, you know, it's something like that. It's like, oh, it's kind of a curiosity. On the other hand, I've been in many, many countries talking about all the things we're talking about, and made so many wonderful friends and met so many fantastic people. I mean, there are people around the world who are interested. It just has to be in front of them. When I'm talking about these things, I'm talking about them in national conservatories or major theater institutions. They're theater people, and they feel the truth of what Kandinsky says. They feel it, working with a text, how to build something, how to, that balance I was talking about in his teaching of being able to analyze and synthesize, to take things apart and put them together, to look at something in terms of its complexity and then something in terms of its simplicity. I just love that people feel the reality of it. So those people, I don't know even. The context is so different. I don't even know if they know Kandinsky. I don't know. It feels like they're very separate. The people who just are loving Kandinsky's paintings and the people who are reading a lot of him.
That's a great answer. Maybe now is the time to bring up the series and tell our listeners a little bit about the series.
I mentioned the Brazil project that we did some time ago. And as the guest editor for that volume in Brazil, my idea was to do everything. In fact, I called it Kandinsky Beyond Painting. So it was everything else, not even, I had kind of the conceit of the issue was that we wouldn't even mention the word painting. We wouldn't even mention that he was a painter. We would talk about his relationship to dance, to music, to poetry, to architecture, and just everything else. Organized like that into a series, into sections. Now everybody on Kandinsky and music, now everybody on Kandinsky and dance, now everybody on something. And in fact, I can say diplomatically that the issue turned out somewhat differently from how I had pictured it when I was first invited to do it. But I had all these wonderful essays. And so I took them to the cultural magazine where I have been writing for 20 years now, most of 20 years. It's called Scene 4, SCENE and the number 4. It's an international arts and cultural magazine online. The editor calls it a print magazine online. And just talked with the editor about doing something with all these marvelous essays that I had. And he agreed to host my own series, my own Kandinsky series. It's called Kandinsky Anew. And so I was able to take the best of the essays from the Brazil project and create Kandinsky Anew. And then since then, I have been in touch with other writers who have added and been eager to write on Kandinsky, something about Kandinsky besides his writing. And then I started co-authoring some of the monthly entries with Yelena. Now that series is monthly.
It's a really cool series. I really enjoyed all the installments. You get to know Kandinsky and all the aspects from all these international scholars, and it's fascinating.
But it's not only scholars, it's also artists and theater people, and I always hope for more of that too. So as I say, Zarina has a marvelous piece in there, she from the original Brazil project. And also November 1st is coming a new entry, which is a lecture that I gave for Zarina in San Francisco, 2015 or something.
I know Kandinsky was spiritually oriented, and I remember reading some of his general thoughts on art and intuition and spirituality, and I got the impression that he would universalize the creative impulse, the creative force, as something that is a primary element, and all the formal manifestations of what an artwork becomes are. And that makes me, as a translator, to muse on the translation of art between the different mediums. So for instance, between poetry and painting and theater. So I'm wondering, like, did Kandinsky actually conceive of things that way? And if so, did he have any views about the translation of works of art into different mediums? And a related question is, did he have any specific literary translations, such as translation of poetry, since he wrote in a number of languages?
This was about translating from one artistic discipline to another. He said that he didn't believe that translating from one art to another was either possible or desirable. And that's something important to me, because I constantly see people referring to Kandinsky's paintings as painted music. And he himself was quite exasperated by that, and wrote at various times, no, I don't want to paint music. And then he tried to explain that. He said, it's not possible to translate from one art to another, or desirable, period. I also talked about the difference between his idea of synthesizing, or bringing together, fusing, encompassing all the art forms, that his idea was different from everybody else's ideas. Everybody else was trying to find the parallels, and he was thinking in terms of counterpoint. So instead of, the lights and the music are doing the same thing. If the lights are coming up, the music is getting softer. If they're always working separately and against each other. So he calls that counterpoint. It would just be important to mention, in the context of your questions, that Kandinsky had synesthesia. He was synesthetic. So for him, this was effortless, this crossing from one art form to another. He was experiencing them simultaneously. And I always say, sometimes I think a lot of what he did in his painting and in his other works was trying to give other people who didn't have synesthesia the experience that he was having all the time.
As someone who has synesthesia, I can tell you, and everybody has their own synesthesia, so mine is different from Kandinsky, but he could not do it. It would be impossible for a person with synesthesia to do things differently.
Yeah.
So this is one of many aspects how I relate, because it's so clear to me.
You mentioned the word spirituality, and I always say, I think that word is terrifically fraught nowadays. It just has a lot of baggage. And I am always trying to find another way of talking about his impulse, his sense of everything that's invisible, that nevertheless has total bearing on our experience of things. So we might call that invisible. We might call it non-material. I'm sure he used the word spiritual. I just am kind of sorry that that word is so often associated with him because it sounds kind of hokey or kind of new age.
That's the drawback of translation, for a lack of a better word, because in Russian it's a духовном в искусстве. Spiritual is only one connotation of духовный, because духовный is coming from дух, which is spirit, but also soul.
Even the word soul, I mean, when you say something about the Russian soul, that is a completely different entity. It's a part of a very deep culture with many reverberations in the mind and ear of the hearer that we don't have in English. And you just translate a bunch of Kandinsky stuff with spiritual this and soul this and that, and it just sounds hokey and kind of overwrought, or at the worst it sounds kind of bombastic.
Well, that's one of these complexities that keep his heritage alive and makes us think and explore it more. I know, like, for me, it's inspiring to try and find all these levels and bring it together in different languages. And so it's a challenge. I appreciate you bringing your Kandinsky knowledge and love for Kandinsky's all aspects of his art and his words and his writing, his music, his poetry to everyone. This was absolutely marvelous. I encourage everyone to check out the resources that we mentioned, that Lisa has mentioned, her collaborators, translators, co-authors, the essays that are forthcoming in Scene 4 online magazine, which is a fantastic magazine in its own stand, not just for Kandinsky scholarship. And we will for sure be bringing Lissa Tyler Renaud with Kandinsky Talks back for Globus. We also have a number of talks forthcoming in fall and winter. We will have the arts talk on Magda Neichmann by Lena Bernstein. She already did one installment on Leon Bakst, which is the world of art, and on which I am planning to bring in more speakers, and also in plans Ballet Russe with Diaghilev, and Kandinsky had his moment with Diaghilev Ballet, but this is all in the future. So stay with us, explore. There are a lot of other poetry readings, literary translation roundtables in store, and a music show of a completely different kind. We're bringing Joanna Stingray, who is was called an American muse of Soviet underground rock. It's all the world of art. And as we know, it, as Kandinsky said, and Lisa quoted in the beginning, the art expands, or I think explodes, the walls of the prison of our existence. So many thanks to Lisa for your brilliant presentation and reading, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Everybody should hear all the different talks from this Globus series. They are absolutely marvelous.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening. We'll see you all soon. Bye now.